What's up, everybody? This is John Odermatt, the host of Felony Friday, and before we get rolling into today's show, I want to take a quick moment to talk about coffee. That's right, coffee. The Lions of Liberty, we have partnered up with Anarcho Coffee, and we are selling our very own coffee. It's called the Morning Roar. It is a medium dark roast that has cupping notes of lemon lime, caramel, black pepper, and brown sugar. It is delicious. You can pick up some of this coffee by going to lionsofliberty.com/coffee. We have a way there on your first purchase. You can get 10% off, but if you join the Pride for $10 and up, you can actually get more than that. You can get 15% off every single order. Buy some coffee, support the Lions of Liberty, support another great libertarian company as well. Everybody wins. lionsofliberty.com/coffee.
Welcome to Felony Friday, a presentation of the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here is your host, John Odermatt.
Felons, friends, and freedom lovers, welcome back to another edition of Felony Friday, a weekly show right here on the Lions of Liberty podcast. For those of you listening for the first time, you're like, what is Felony Friday? What is Lions of Liberty? Well, Lions of Liberty is a podcast network. We have 3 different podcasts on this network. The first one is every Monday. It's our longest running program, our flagship program. The host is Mark Clara, and on that show, Mark interviews leaders in the libertarian movement. Our Wednesday show is more of a current event style show focused on things going on in culture, comedy, and also, of course, our host, Brian McWilliams, gives you his take on the libertarian aspects of that. Friday, this show, Felony Friday, it's focused on the criminal justice system, on shining a light in areas in the system where there's been injustice. And today's episode is especially important, super important. We're going to be talking once again about the Jerry Sandusky and Penn State scandal. Now, for those of you listening, there might be people out there who know nothing about it other than the accepted narrative that the media has told you about and you think is probably 100% fact, and it's just a slam dunk, nothing to talk about. There's probably other people out there who have heard my work on this before, the previous episodes. I would say both sides, either before or right now, or I would say probably after this interview. If you haven't, go to lionsofliberty.com/Sandusky. You can hear all of the episodes that I've done where I've interviewed people who've spent a lot of time looking into this case, like John Ziegler, Mark Pendergrast, Ralph Cipriano, talking with those guys, getting their take on it, and learning what they know. And also on that page is an interview. I was a guest on Pete Mance Rader's show, talking about everything I know and have learned about this case. Now, today's guest on the show is John Snedden, and a lot of people don't know this, even those who are well-versed in this case. There was a federal investigation into the Sandusky case. So we're going to talk about that, talk about the conclusions that came from that. They are going to blow a hole in your mind so big you're not going to know what hit you if you haven't heard of this before. So we'll get to that in just 1 minute. Before we do that, I want to remind you, the show notes page for this episode, this is episode 175 of Felony Friday. So you can find the show notes at lionsofliberty.com/FF175. If you're a long-time listener or a first-time listener, we would love it if you subscribe to our show wherever you listen to podcasts, be it Apple or Stitcher. Please subscribe to the show. Please leave us a rating, 5-star rating, and a nice review if you enjoy what you listen to. If you don't, just don't leave a review. Just forget about it. We don't want to hear from you if you don't like it. But if you do like it, please let us know. That's all I got, guys. Let's get rolling with today's show. My guest today on Felony Friday is John Snedden. John is a veteran NCIS Special Agent, previous NCIS Special Agent of the Year, and NCIS Cold Case Squad Plank owner. And he holds the distinction of having been one of the few federal agents to have been appointed and cross-designated as a special agent for the Office of Attorney General, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Subsequently, John was also the recipient of the 2012 Federal Sustained Superior Performance Award, and he's currently working as an investigative consultant. The reason I wanted to bring John on the show, I don't know how many people out there are familiar with this, if they've looked into the work of my previous guest, John Ziegler, who has interviewed John Snedden in the past, but John Snedden was the Federal Investigative Services Special Agent who looked into specifically investigating former Penn State President Graham Spanier as a part of his review for to have his top secret security clearance renewed. And there was a report that John issued after that probably most of you haven't heard about, but we're going to be talking about that today. John, welcome to Felony Friday.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
Well, it's great to have you on the show, and I've wanted to have you on as a guest for quite a while, actually. And I was kind of just looking for an opportunity where it sort of aligned with some things that were happening, either with current events in the trial with the Penn State Jerry Sandusky scandal. And that happened was last week or 10 days ago or so when Graham Spanier's conviction was thrown out by a judge, and obviously that was a big focus of your report, and we want to get into talking about your report and your findings and all that stuff. But before we go down that road, just so everyone's clear what your role was, let's sort of backtrack a little bit into the role of a federal investigative special agent. How did you get into that role? What's your background in?
Well, I was previously a special agent with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, investigated felony criminal offenses and counterintelligence matters for the Department of the Navy, which has a jurisdiction over individuals and exclusive federal jurisdiction worldwide. So, and then I subsequently became a special agent with the Federal Investigative Service, which conducts investigations to determine people's suitability to have access to national security information. And in the case of Dr. Spanier, the circumstance arose that there was an allegation that resulted in his departure from his position. And because of the fact that he held a high-level security clearance, the federal government wanted to determine what the circumstances were surrounding that, particularly if he would have been susceptible to any possible coercion, pressure, duress, or blackmail as a result of that circumstance.
Just to be clear on what the security clearance that Dr. Spanier, I think he still has it, right? It's been renewed as far as I know. But what exactly, how high level of a security clearance did he have?
Well, there's various levels above. It's a continuum. You have confidential, you have secret, you have top secret, and you have sensitive compartmented information above the top secret level, and his was above the top secret level.
Okay, so let's flash back here. So at what point this is 2011 was when everything goes down. That's when Jerry Sandusky was charged. That's when Tim Curley, Gary Schultz, the Penn State administrators were charged. Spanier was charged later. At what point were you brought in to investigate the security clearance?
It was very early, 2012, I believe. Very early 2012. Once, once the action had been taken and Dr. Spanier was no longer in his position, we had to evaluate whether or not that course of action would cause him to be susceptible again to any possible coercion, pressure, duress, or blackmail, or if there was anything that caused that action to take place that would cause him to be susceptible to any possible coercion, pressure, duress, or blackmail.
So Because at the same time, or I'm not sure if it was at the same time, but Louis Freeh, the former FBI director, was doing an investigation as well into what happened at Penn State, commissioned by the Board of Trustees, of course, to look into that. And of course, that report that Louis Freeh came out with was used at the time to penalize Penn State, scholarships, wins taken away, which was nullified, and the wins were given back to Joe Paterno in the end. But to get to my question here, did your investigation overlap at the same time that Louis Freeh was doing his investigation?
To some degree, yes. You have to keep in mind that while Freeh's private investigation was highly publicized, the federal investigation was not. Mm-hmm. And no one was aware of that. When we conduct those types of investigations, we do not yell it from the rooftops that we're conducting an investigation. So neither Freeh nor the Attorney General's office of Pennsylvania knew that there was a federal investigation being conducted concurrently with theirs.
Did Freeh, that you know of, did Freeh become aware of it? I think I remember hearing something of Graham Spanier bringing it up in one of his interviews with Louis Freeh that he was being investigated.
Well, it was a perfunctory run on Dr. Spanier, I believe, at the conclusion of Freeh's private investigation. It appears he had already written his report, and it was a perfunctory exercise by Freeh to make inquiry of Dr. Spanier. And he was, at that time, Dr. Spanier, and actually that took place immediately prior to Freeh's pronouncement in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, his report wasn't available for people to review, so he had the first shot at whatever he wanted to say without people having the benefit of actually looking into his investigation. And Dr. Spanier at that time, when he was interviewed by Freeh, advised Freeh that there was a federal investigation conducted, which subsequently resulted in his the renewal of his top secret security clearance. And Freeh, as a political appointee, and the previous positions that he held, knew or should have known the significance of that federal investigation. But when Dr. Spanier brought it to his attention, and there were 5 people in the room, when Dr. Spanier brought it to Freeh's attention, Freeh immediately became disinterested and left the room. And that was the first time, I believe that was the first time that Freeh knew that there was a concurrent, undisclosed federal investigation that was conducted. That's
very, very interesting. And Freeh has made, to my knowledge, has made no comment about it publicly in any way. So let's get into your conclusions first here from your investigation. So just to give my listeners a brief overview, and of course I've done a bunch of interviews on the Penn State Sandusky scandal. You can go listen to any of those at lionsofliberty.com/Sandusky. I've done interviews with John Ziegler, a bunch of other people who have done a lot of research into this case, plus my interview where I was interviewed by Pete Mance-Rader. That was about a few months ago, where I went in depth on this case as well. So we're not going to deep dive here, but just so everyone's clear, what we're talking about here is probably the incident that everyone is familiar with who knows even just a little bit about this Penn State situation, where the boy in the shower incident, and that is where the alleged charges of cover-up come from, I should say conspiracy. Graham Spanier, the former PSU president, Tim Curley, and Gary Schultz were implicated in in a cover-up, in a conspiracy. And Joe Paterno was as well, but of course Paterno had passed away, so he was never charged. And of course, none of those charges stuck. But here we are today. So you're investigating back then. You're investigating Graham Spanier for the security clearance. I'm sure looking into if there's any sort of cover-up or anything like that happened. What were your conclusions of your investigation?
Well, the conclusion of my investigation was that there was no conspiracy. There was no cover-up, and there was nothing to cover up. So, I can't put it any clearer than that. The allegations were not credible. He's certainly the individual that made the initial foggy allegation was not able to communicate anything that was indicative of a sexual assault of any type. You obviously, it brings you to the thought of of an individual that's 6'5", 200 and some pounds. He's a Division I college football player, quarterback, that's used to running away from 350-pound defensive linemen. If he happens to see somebody in the shower assaulting a young boy, your moral compass would certainly tell you not to flee and to intervene. But did in fact he indicate that he intervened in any fashion? No, he did not intervene. You've got a wet, defenseless older gentleman in the shower, and you're not going to intervene if you see a child being assaulted.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all.
If you're not going to intervene personally, wouldn't you call the authorities from the Lash building immediately and have them intervene? Did that happen? No,
did not happen. So,
and that witness, Mike McQuarrie, has made numerous, has come out with numerous stories about what occurred, none of which are the same. So it plays to his credibility. In addition to that, Mike McQuarrie appears to have a particular fascination with sex, which clearly can be observed if you Google Mike McQuarrie dick pics on the internet, and you'll have all your answers, all your questions answered in that regard.
Yeah, actually, when the police first went to interview McQuarrie about this alleged incident, when they got wind that he might have seen something, he thought that they were there to talk to him about using a Penn State phone to send pictures of his dick to a woman who was not his wife. But he was relieved that was not the case. But since then, even more recently, he has sent pictures of his dick to other women.
It's an obsession, apparently.
I guess. So during your investigation, was there any sense or anything that looked at all like a conspiracy of cover-up? Any evidence of any sort of cover-up?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that occurred, particularly after having spoken with everybody that I spoke with. I mean, I spoke with Dr. Spanier himself under oath for at least 8 hours. I interviewed Gary Schultz, and I interviewed Tim Curley, and I interviewed Rodney Erickson, and I interviewed several members of the Board of Trustees, and I interviewed the individuals that were involved in Jerry Sandusky's retirement, across the board, and there was absolutely no indication of any conspiracy or cover-up, or a crime for that matter. other than the political corruption that has taken place and continues to take place to have this continue as it has.
What do you mean by political corruption?
Well, I think if you look at the big picture of this case, it's appalling how political corruption played into this entire case. And, not only this case, but there's been, you've got a whole list of victims now that can be identified as a result of that political corruption. You can look at Dr. Spanier. You can look at Monsignor Lin. If you look at the continuum of what took place here, you see a vindictive governor that felt Dr. Spanier's fight for state funding. He took that as evidently must have taken it as a personal attack, which caused him to become exceptionally vindictive. And you've got other individuals on the board of trustees that had their own particular motivations. Mm-hmm. And then you've got, right now you have a prosecutor that involved in this case that is awaiting some degree of disciplinary action, that being Frank Fina. So, if you take a look at the continuum of the case, you can tell that it was manipulated in a way that would have the impacts that they wanted. Just as an example, with the free private investigation, mm-hmm. It's exactly what you would expect from a private investigation.
So a lot of people might be surprised by that, because they would say, well, why would Penn State want an investigation to show that they were that their administrators participated in a cover-up?
Well, clearly they didn't take the time and effort to determine what the facts were before they took action. Mm-hmm. And, which is appalling in itself. If you're going to take action as significant as they did, without any facts at hand, whenever you have these cases, particularly from an investigative standpoint, and they certainly should have been looking at it from that perspective, because they have no idea what's going on. They don't know where they're getting the information from, and is in fact that information credible. It would have been much better had they sat back, took a breath, and said, hey, what exactly are we looking at? As opposed to, reacting to what we know to have been a blatantly fictitious presentment on the part of the Attorney General's office, which was designed to do exactly that, to make people, react to a falsehood before they had the opportunity to realize it was in fact false.
So when you interviewed, you said several people on the Board of Trustees, since the Board of Trustees was largely responsible for removing, they were responsible for removing Coach Paterno and for firing Tim Curley, Gary Schultz, and eventually President Spanier. Did any of them give, what did they think happened? Did they think that there was a conspiracy, or?
No, absolutely not. The circumstances are such, and I think a lot of people do not realize that there was no vote. There was no vote at the Board of Trustees. The chairman at that time relinquished his, and I interviewed him, and he's, you can certainly read the report, and you can come to the same conclusion.
Yeah, but, I'll link to the report.
Yeah, the chairman, the Board of Trustees chairman at that time, relinquished his position primarily because it was a very unusual circumstance that they were facing, and one of the Board of Trustees accepted the position as chairman and took over, and he made a statement. We need to essentially, more or less, we need to fire Joe Paterno, and we need to fire Dr. Spanier. Does anyone object? And that was the extent of it. There was no vote. And
at this, sorry to interrupt you, but at that vote, Tom Corbett's in the room, right? Tom Corbett, the governor, the previous governor of Pennsylvania. And did Tom Corbett, he opened the investigation into Jerry Sandusky. Is that correct?
Yeah, and every indication is that, interestingly enough, he's not interestingly enough now, having the knowledge that we do now, he slow-walked that investigation. And, it just so happened to line up with, his aspirations and his motivations, which were vindictive. Yeah. So, interestingly enough, again, if you read that report, you'll realize that Governor Corbett had never, ever been to a Board of Trustees meeting prior to this event, and suddenly became incredibly interested. So, that hasn't happened in the past, but it did happen in this particular circumstance.
This case, obviously, probably more toxic of a case than I've ever seen before, ever really heard covered in the media before. If anyone seems to come out and go against even just chipping away at the narrative a little bit, there's massive pushback.
Their focus is on the wrong thing. The focus should be political corruption. That's exactly what they're looking at, and that's what caused all this damage. It's political corruption.
Political corruption, instigated by Tom Corbett, and it was deeper than that. Goes well,
I think there were certain members of the Board of Trustees at that time that had their own personal vendettas, and they certainly lined up with and could be served through coattailing with Governor Corbett's interest and vindictiveness.
Mm-hmm. So has anybody in the media, obviously you said at the time the actual investigation was ongoing, it was secretive, it was not publicized, but the report was made public through a Freedom of Information Act, correct?
Yes.
When was that, 2016, 2017? Or?
I think Dr. Spanier had access to it prior to that, but it was not made public until immediately prior to his trial.
So after it was made public, did any major media outlets, have they approached you to talk to you, being the individual who did this investigation?
No, I think they were under the false impression that there was only the free investigation in the PA Attorney General's investigation.
I mean, I think I'm right here to assume that this is massive news, that there was a federal investigation that vindicated at least Graham Spanier, but you could argue vindicates Joe Paterno from blame, Tim Curley, Gary Schultz. So you have a situation where either that changes the whole story, or I don't know. It's like
I agree, and I think they failed to. Investigative journalism, with the exception of a few people I know, yourself included, is dead. Other than yourself and Ralph Cipriano and John Ziegler and several other people that. Other than that, it's they just take the narrative and they run with it. And I think that one of the major problems is that they bought the free report without even reading it. And the Attorney General's office, although they know that the contents of that presentment were false, and they can't unreport what they reported. You know, I think that's the major problem. I think somebody clearly needs to step forward and say, hey, you know, okay, we were sold a bill of goods, and this is the actual circumstance. I mean, they're at least as far as I'm concerned, they're the watchdog. I mean, if you don't have a investigative journalism entity, you cannot keep people in check, and that's what the circumstance happened here. I mean, they clearly, the powers that be, Free and the Attorney General's office, attempted to utilize that journalistic willingness to accept anything, as opposed to actually trying to investigate what happened. They used that against the prevailing truth, and got their false story out by screaming it from the rooftops at the earliest point possible.
So, last question for you. We have, obviously, Jerry Sandusky is in prison. There's been appeals that have not resulted in another trial. There's definitely different avenues to take. I'm not sure if we'll ever get another trial or not. Do you think that he deserves another trial? What would be like your ideal situation? I don't know if it would happen. Does he get another trial in your mind? Would that be something that's warranted?
Well, without question, he deserves a new trial. If you just look at what occurred in Dr. Spanier's trial, and if you look what occurred in Monsignor Lynn's trial, most legal minds would be appalled by that. And to think that the circumstances under which Dr. Spanier was found guilty of a misdemeanor crime that didn't exist when he was charged with it, and then
the law wasn't on the books, right? That they used
exactly. But the big important thing here is that case was reviewed by several levels of the Pennsylvania judiciary, who agreed with it until it hit the federal court, which is indicative that and obviously the federal court saw, whoa, hey, you can't possibly do that. Well, in all likelihood, the Monsignor Lynn case may very well end up in the same circumstance, and it makes you really wonder, how much did they manipulate all of these cases? I think when it comes to political corruption and manipulation of the case to satisfy a political motivation and an agenda-driven motivation, you've got a group of victims. As a matter of fact, any case that the Attorney General's office handled that involves the prosecutors that took this case and did what they did to it in an incredible miscarriage of justice, every one of their cases is tainted. Every case that they've had should be looked at and examined to determine exactly what they did do. I mean, there should be truckloads of lawyers storming Strawberry Square to find out what they did to their cases. I mean, you can't put these three cases in a tiny funnel, because the people that were doing them are clearly doing them with different motivations than justice.
Yeah. I mean, if you just look at the outset of the Sandusky trial, when he was charged, I think at the same time they also charged Tim Curley and Gary Schultz, where if they had not been charged there, you're going to see the case play out in a much different way. I think.
Exactly. I mean, they certainly would have testified to what they, during the course of my interview, and there was no indication whatsoever from the alleged witness that there was any sexual involvement whatsoever. And that's certainly, it's clear that the prosecution of the case was manipulated in a way to satisfy their motivations. I mean, Free had to fulfill, in his private investigation, he had to fulfill the motivations of his clients and his handlers. The Attorney General's office, obviously, with what occurred there, and where do you begin with how they screwed that up? I mean, with what occurred there, clearly they had a predetermined agenda that they went after, and the whole thing is appalling. And I certainly think that all the cases that they were involved in should certainly be evaluated now that we know that they were less than candid in regard to what information they did have and how they manipulated that information to get their personal goals, which is not part of the justice system.
Hey, have you seen any other corruption on this scale throughout your career anywhere else? I mean, obviously, probably some stuff you can't talk about, but I guess to get to the heart of the question is this sort of typical? No, I mean, absolutely not. I mean, this is, again, if you examine this thing from the get-go, it's clear what occurred. You'll have small cases of corruption in smaller municipalities or, within various chains. But this one, when you, again, I have to come back to the fact that this alleged misdemeanor conviction was reviewed by several levels of the Pennsylvania judiciary, none of which had a problem with it. I mean, what does that tell you? I mean, it has to get to the federal level for somebody to make a, independent determination that you have any integrity, that has some integrity. I mean, the same thing with Jerry's case. I mean, if the Pennsylvania judiciary continues to protect the miscarriage of justice, to protect the Pennsylvania judiciary and the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, he's going to have to, look for a ruling from the federal courts. And clearly there were significant problems with the state's case against him. And again, he's not the only victim in that. We've seen by Dr. Spanier victim and Monsignor Lynn a victim. And how many other victims are out there? That's what I'd like to know. And I'm sure there's a lot of attorneys whose clients would like to know that as well. Well, you could say to a much less degree than Dr. Spanier or people who were implicated in this, but even people holding a Penn State degree have been tarnished in some way by this.
Well, that's the governor is the former governor is a graduate of a private institution and is not fond of public education. And I certainly think that having a Penn State degree probably doesn't, he doesn't appreciate that.
Yeah. It's a crazy world we live in, John.
Yes.
Thank you for coming on the show and being generous with your time. And you're always welcome back.
Well, it's a pleasure to be there. But I got to tell you, it's the most appalling case of political corruption that I've seen, and it's ongoing, and there's a lot of devastation that should have never happened.
Yeah, there's no end in sight, really.
Right. It's got to get to the all of these cases have to get to the federal level where they're outside the influence of Pennsylvania politics.
Mm-hmm. All right, John. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, that's a wrap, guys. Want to thank John Snedden for being so generous with his time and coming on the show, coming on Felony Friday to talk with you guys today. And this case is just so absolutely ridiculous. John, the way that he looks at it, and one could argue that he knows more about this case, at least specific aspects surrounding the inner workings of the incident involving the shower incident, the alleged cover-up, that John knows more about that than anyone else. And not only that, he's written a 110-page report on it, gathering all the evidence surrounding it, and found not only that Graham Spanier was not involved in a cover-up, a crime of any kind, but that no crime occurred, and that it's not even close. Talking with him more, and even after the interview, we talked for a while just about the level of corruption in the judicial system in the state of Pennsylvania. And the thing that is, people don't see it coming, obviously, because 99.999% of the people out there think what they were told, what they've learned from the media about this case, what they saw happen during the trial. They think that's what this case is. It's a slam dunk. Jerry Sandusky's a child pedophile. All the victims are telling the truth. Joe Paterno allowed it to happen. They don't question any of that. When this stuff does come to light, and I'm not as convinced as John Snedden that it will make it to the federal level. I think they're slow playing this for a reason, hoping that Jerry Sandusky dies before that can happen. That's really going to be the key there. If Jerry can live long enough, I think we will see truth in this case, because as John Snedden said, when it does get to that federal level, which we saw what happened with Graham Spanier when it got to the federal level, the judge threw it out because the charge, or what Graham Spanier was convicted of a crime that didn't even exist during the time period that he was charged and convicted of it during. It wasn't even on the books back then. So for that to go through, and for other Pennsylvania judges to stand behind the ruling, stand behind violating the Constitution, that's insanity. That's corruption of the highest degree. So that got to the federal level and got thrown out. When the whole Sandusky case gets up there, it's going to be, the blowback is going to be one of the biggest scandals we've ever seen in the history of, history of anything. It's going to be completely insanity. And I just want to encourage you one more time, if you have not listened and learned all the details about this case that you don't know, that the mainstream media hasn't talked about, the medical records of Jerry Sandusky that make it very, very evident that not only did these crimes not occur, but that because of Jerry Sandusky's medical condition, which he has low testosterone, and he does not have testicles, basically doesn't have testicles, the crimes could not have happened. And not one of his victims mentioned that at any point, during any testimony, during any of this whole thing. It's never been brought up. And those medical records were not brought up during the trial. That's just getting into one small aspect of it. This case, and John Ziegler says this all the time talking about this case, it's not that this is like, maybe he's, just not guilty and they can't prove it. It's not even close in my mind that Jerry Sandusky is innocent. And John Ziegler, a couple months ago, was supposed to be, actually, an interview was recorded, John Ziegler on Thaddeus Russell's show, Unregistered, which never aired. And that's shocking to me, that somebody who I have a lot of respect for Thaddeus Russell, but that gives you an idea of the toxicity of this case. That somebody like Thaddeus Russell, I can only assume, because I know it was recorded and I've heard from John Ziegler what went on during the interview, if for that not to air, because Thaddeus Russell is maybe afraid of stepping out and going against the grain here because of the nature and the toxicity of this case? If Thaddeus Russell's afraid of it, God, this is why no one in the media has questioned it. This case will blow your mind when you start looking into it. And the very fact that a federal investigator, and I know people, libertarian listeners, will say this or that about the feds and federal investigators. Listen, this is a guy who it's his job to do this. It's his job to make sure that, or it was his job, he's not a current federal investigator, to look into these issues of national security. So whichever side you fall on with that, there's a scandal here, looking at the results of this investigation. So when I reached out to some media outlets around Pennsylvania after John Snedden's report was made public back in 2017, 110-page report, exonerating Spanier, Curley, Schultz, and Paterno, in my mind, exonerating all of them from any collusion or conspiracy. When that was released, I sent out a bunch of emails to a lot of local Pennsylvania media outlets, and I said, essentially, guys, here, look at it this way. You got one of two things. Either way, it is a massive, massive news story. You got one thing where the feds investigated this incident, the shower incident, that almost took down Penn State University. And the federal agent who investigated said not only was there the people involved did not commit a crime, but there's no crime that occurred. There was nothing to cover up. Not only was there no cover up, there was nothing to cover up that happened. So you have that. So, I mean, that's a big story in itself. If you want to go against it, if you want to say, I don't believe that, then you have a story there also, because you have a federal agent who's giving security clearance to a guy like Graham Spanier that the public thinks is a pedophile enabler. That's a massive story. So either way you look at it, you got a massive story, and either way you look at it, the media completely ignored it. And when that happens, I've lost all trust in the media. All trust. Because all they care about is maintaining that narrative. Because they are fully invested in that narrative, as are all the major players in this story. So guys, I'll stop rambling. This is something I'm passionate about because this is massive, massive injustice going on. As John pointed out several times during the interview, that is far-reaching. And, there's a lot of victims to this injustice. And if this is, if you agree with me and you think that there is an injustice here, this same Pennsylvania judicial system, what else have they done? What other corruption has caused them to lead to more injustice, has caused them to ruin more lives? I don't know. But I think there needs to be a thorough investigation of every single case that these bastards touched. And that's the way it should be. I'm not saying that's the way it's going to be, but that's the way it should be. And with that being said, guys, if you like this show, if you like Lions of Liberty, please come support us. Patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. Get bonus content, a bunch of other stuff. Come check it out. Patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. That's all I got, guys. This is John Odermatt signing off. Always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.